Let's talk about some extended dialogue sequences in Yakuza 6. Extended dialogue is the tofu of cutscenes. It doesn't really have any flavor on its own, but it absorbs flavor well and it marinates. So when you want to introduce a villain, one thing you can do is have them dive into the scene guns a-blazing, but another thing you can do is use an extended dialogue scene and let the villainy soak in slowly. All you have to do is surround the dialogue scenes with things that have the right tone. So for example, you got music, you got blocking, you got camera shots. Yes, you also have the narrative around the situation, a power imbalance, a struggle for dominance, and of course the fact that the player is coming in off of having just mastered Chapter 1. We've conquered all the things the game has set ahead of us so far, and now we're looking for a new challenge. Hey look, here's a new challenge. We're feeling the urge to get into a conflict. Here's a guy who's conflicting with us. That adds to the marinade. Now, what you say does matter, and we'll talk about that later, but the main point of this kind of extended cutscene is to allow you to soak in the correct feel, the correct tone. And then, in this case, that means villainy, because we're about to meet Someya, a mid-game antagonist. So rather than paying attention to what's being said, I'd like to pay attention to what's around it. What is the marinade that is giving this tofu its flavor? Let's take a look. Let's watch through it once on its own and see if we can pick up on it.
お初にお目にかかります。4代目。どうも、染谷一家総長の染谷です。この度は無所でのお務め、ご苦労様でした。
俺が来るのを待ってたってわけか。
うちの子分が4代目に誤解を受けるような真似を。どうかご容赦ください。
誤解ってのはどういうことだ。
はは、立ち話もなんですから、そのあたりも含めて中でじっくり話しませんか。4代目もお勤め明けたばかりでお疲れでしょうし、菅井さんもぜひご挨拶したいとお待ちしています。菅井さんご存知ですよね。登場会社桐生さんより古い。6代目が不在の今、菅井さんが会長代行です。
俺をつけさせたのはその菅井の差し金か。
まあどうぞ奥へ。俺もゆっくり4代目の若い頃の武勇伝をお伺いできればと思います。どうか往年の極道ってやつを俺ら若造にも勉強させてくださいよ。ねえ。
Exciting. So, now that we've seen that, you could hopefully pick up on the fact that a lot of stuff was contributing to this marinade. It's not a one-spice marinade. We got the music, we got the framing, we got the blocking, we've got the fact that this is basically our home, but it's turned into an enemy encampment. We got a lot of stuff going on. Let's go through it step by step, talk about the individual ingredients some. We're not going to focus too much on the camera work here. We'll mention it here and there, but the camera work for this is a little bit more interesting in terms of usefulness, so we're going to leave off on most of our camera discussions until that video. This starts with a sting, so listen for it. Hear that? Then it goes into drums. This is an antagonist's background music, but it's very soft and very subtle. This shot is excellent. So there's always this urge to show as much as possible with an establishing shot. Like, oh, I want the Tojo to feel big and dangerous, so I'll show shots of their entire campus. I'll do a low shot of a giant skyscraper. But sometimes it's just as powerful to show a shot of something that should be small, but is way too big. In this case, this is their walk-in entryway. And it's huge. It's way too big. And just showing how big one tiny part of the Tojo is, we can give an impression of how large the rest is. This is a very imposing situation. By constraining our establishing shot to something that is in a human scale where we can clearly see ourselves, we can actually put ourselves in that shot in a meaningful way, as well as put in as many enemies as we want. So this is Someya in the pinstripe. That's us. Low shot, center as usual. This is Someya in the pinstripes. He's the only one dressed differently for obvious reasons. It's worth noting that the ties of the Tojo clan are pretty important. Someya's got a purple tie with bleeding knifed hearts, and that's pretty clearly perfectly indicative of who he is. And I think they did this because the Tojo clan in this game doesn't have any tattoos worth mentioning. Someya doesn't have any, and we never see the other Tojo clan villains back. So I think they wanted some other way to represent these characters, and they did it through their fashion choices. Someya's got gangster pinstripes on, and he's got a purple tie, like a greasy purple tie with knife wounds all over it. Tells you who he is right up front, in case his demeanor wasn't clear enough. Now, we're going to see some two shots like this where it's over our shoulder or over his shoulder, but the majority of the camera shots are specifically to frame us as in opposition. Neither of us wants to move. We both plant our feet and we both glare at each other. So most of the camera shots are either going to be of us directly opposing each other or of us staring straight down the barrel of the camera. And that's pretty much the choices for the camera shots here. Now everybody's done moving. We're just gonna brace ourselves and butt heads. That's as far as he ever bends until the end of the game. This shot really shows that we're in opposition to each other. It's a very low angle to show that we're both big. And we're discussing something of no importance here, but we're doing it to soak in the marinade of this situation with its threatening feel. So this is a little bit subtle if you're not Japanese. At least I think so. If you're a big dumb American, you may not really realize what's going on unless you really focus here. This is a battle of dominance. Someya wants Kiryu to admit that Someya is the one in charge here. And so he keeps asking him to do an innocuous thing. Come inside. Don't worry about anything. Just come inside. Just come inside. And Kiryu is not willing to move yet. And then, of course, Someya is also using this opportunity to diminish Kiryu by saying, oh, you must feel so tired. You must be so old. Why don't you come inside? Oh, you must be very tired. Come inside. And the idea here is that if he can get Kiryu to move, he's won this little headbutt. You can also see the tie here in much more detail. Knives through hearts.
4代目もお勤め明けたばかりでお疲れでしょうし、菅井さんもぜひご挨拶したいとお待ちしています。菅井さんご存知ですよね。登場会社桐生さんより古い。6代目が不在の今、菅井さんが会長代行です。
俺をつけさせたのは その菅井の差し金か?
Did you hear how the music picked up there? It went from to-dum, 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 to chaka 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 chaka. That's because Kiryu is starting to put some pressure on, so the tension is starting to go up. And that's why we also get these much tighter shots here. It's pretty standard. You're so old, Kiryu. Your time has passed. So he's been really pushing for Kiryu to just obey and come inside. And Kiryu is trying to figure out exactly how to do this while winning the battle of dominance here. So he makes a decision on how to do it. A push-in, a sting, another long framing shot with a push-in, and then Kiryu walks through Someya with a really heavy music sting to back it up. What's fun about that shot is they show us a variant of it later in the game, which changes the meaning of this scene a little bit, which is always good. I love that stuff. So hopefully that showed you a little bit about how you can trickle charge your villain. The point there is the long dialogue sequence allowed us to deliver all of the flavors of the villain of the week without ever having to openly show any sort of villainy. And that allows us to remain, in theory, friendly with the Tojo. In case you are completely new at this, the Tojo is our mafia base. We were once in charge of the Tojo. We put the current head in charge of the Tojo, and it's something where this is supposed to be our home. Now here we're going to introduce Sugai. Sugai is a much more late-game villain, and he's introduced in a much more sleek way. He's a lot less openly hostile to us, but there's a lot going on in this scene. Fundamentally, it's the same setup in terms of its marinating villainy. We have a different villain to focus on, and we're going to also explore Someya a little bit more, but the length of the scene is the point. The length of the scene is there specifically to deliver that feeling, that marinade of evil. We're going to go through this in some detail. We're not going to bother to play through it once on its own, just because there's a lot of in-game exposition that we don't really need to talk about. You don't really need to watch it on its own and come to your own conclusions on it. It's just exposition. So we're going to focus a lot on camera shots for this. We're going to talk, about the narrative and stuff too, but there's a lot of times when you're not going to be sure how to set up your camera shots for dialogue. This is a really good example of how to do it, so let's get started. Okay, so one of the problems I've got with Yakuza is that they are very manly man, which means that anybody that shows any sign of not being super manly is automatically a villain. I've had to quit playing Yakuza games before because they're so homophobic and transphobic, and it's really rough. But in this case, the idea is, oh, he's tending his nails, he must be a villain. Great, thanks. Cheap. But there's a couple of things here that are worth discussing. One of those things is that how relaxed he is when Kiryu comes in is part of the point. He's doing his nails. Kiryu comes in, and he keeps doing his nails for a bit to establish dominance. We can also see his tie in the background. So he's got a tie that is blood red. Now, if you haven't played through the game, you might think that that's a little bit of a strange tie for this, sleek old man, this bookkeeper to have. But it's a giveaway. This sleek old man is not a bookkeeper. He's a really vicious asshole, which should be obvious. He's the villain in a Yakuza game.
Domo, tabi-tabi 失礼します。おう、4代目をご案内してまいりました。お久しぶりで4代目。俺の顔 覚えてます？
So there's a lot of things to talk about in terms of framing here. One is that long shot we saw earlier where he's at the far side of the room. He's very distant from everybody. That's on purpose. Making him feel remote is the point. In addition, here you can see he's off-center and he's looking left. We were on the left in the previous shot, so he's talking to us, but he's so remote and he's so off to the side, we haven't reached him yet. And this kind of framing is important when you're talking about two people conversing. How close they are is a big factor. And part of that factor is purely physical, right? Like, how physically close can you bring them? But how you move the camera radically alters how close they feel. You can make two people that are quite far from each other feel close with the right camera shot, and you can make two people standing nose to nose feel far away with the right camera shot. So you can adjust people's social distance by making their physical distance seem to change. As usual, straight down the barrel from a low angle.
やっぱり覚えてませんか。ま、俺は6代目体制になっても名ばかりの相談役でした。無理もない。もうお聞きでしょうが、6代目が
Once again, they're establishing his distance. So the sixth chairman is someone we put in. Sugai is going to begin to feel us out and begin to show his antagonism here. The sixth chairman we put in got arrested and is not available, and Sugai stepped in to pick up the reins. Now here is an interesting situation. Part of what this scene is trying to establish with the dialogue that it chooses to use, Sugai and the other guy, the younger guy who we're standing next to, are not on the same team. They have radically different visions of what it means to be Tojo, what it means to be Yakuza, and how things should go. And that will become more and more obvious as this goes on. That instability within the Tojo clan is a big part of this game, and they're establishing it here while also giving us a chance to realize who the villains are and to have a new focus and to start to move forward. It's also worth noting that the background music here is either silence or evil strings rather than drums, and that's because Sugai is a late game villain. He moves slowly and cautiously, and we don't actually get to fight him until the very end.
4代目から見るにさぞかし頼りないでしょうが。
随分でかいテーブルを入れたんだ
Now
な。
here, Kiryu is saying, you've changed things without my permission. And he's going to laugh and say, yeah, things have changed without your permission. Get used to it.
極道も最近じゃ書類仕事が増えましたんでね。お気に召しませんか。
そこの染谷ってのは。
Now Kiryu is going to start feeling out this crack between the two of them, and it's going to become real obvious pretty quick here. So a few things. They're both sitting at the head of the table. They are being pitched as co-heads. We are supposed to believe that they have, if not equal power, at least equal power within the narrative. Also, how they sit is really indicative of who they are. Someya leans back, goes off kilter, puts his legs up. And of course, we have someone who sits pitched forward, hands tightly grasped on the table. They're just two very different villains, and the way they pose really enhances that. The camera shots will often show two shots of just them to contrast them and to allow them to argue with each other while actually arguing with Kiryu. Like, they'll be talking to Kiryu, but they're really talking at each other.
Yakuza にもいろんなのがいますんで。まあ、どうぞ4代目。
Now here's a subtle little trick. He doesn't take the chair next to them. He leaves an empty chair between him and them. Now I'm sure that this was on purpose. I won't try and say they absolutely did it for a specific reason. No. But to me the reason is clear. That chair is the sixth chairman. is the missing man that Kiryu put in power between him and them. And that empty chair will stand between them for this whole conversation. The camera will frequently, very clearly frame it. In addition to representing the sixth chairman, that empty chair physically separates them and allows this to very clearly be Kiryu versus the two of them.
害するつもりはね。だが、いくつか聞きたいことがある。 Now here they're going to establish that everybody on the planet knows that Haruka is his kid, and nobody would ever screw with Haruka without knowing that she's his kid, because that would be just really stupid. Definitely stupid, so that'll never happen. We'll get to that later. We got some classic two shots here because these two people are talking to each other. The only time we break with the, I mean, not the only time, but the main time that we break with the two-shot reverse shot situation is when we want to push in and really hammer home that there's an emotional tension here, like this. So we go two-shot, we go reverse two-shot, and then we do a close-in where we show that this question is what really matters. The two shots normally represent that the two people are connecting, not necessarily in a friendly way, but they're actually talking to each other rather than at each other. Whereas pushing in like this will generally show that either there is a really high emotional beat or they're no longer talking to each other, they're now talking at each other. Which one is which is pretty obvious from context. This one, for example, is tension. So here we have a nice three-shot, a very rare situation, and you can see what I was saying earlier. If he'd sat in that empty chair, not only would the sixth chairman have been missing, but also he would appear to be closer to Sugai, and that might throw off the balance of the conversation considerably because we're not closer to Sugai. If anything, we're closer to Someya. But leaving that distance makes it clear that it's them versus us, rather than us siding with one or other in this Tojo brawl, this faction brawl that they've got going inside of Tojo. The slow camera movements always help when you're trying to add a little bit of tension to a dialogue scene, but keep in mind that those slow camera movements are usually in the long shots, not in the close shots. Any camera movement in a close-up like this is a powerful statement, a really powerful statement. It means the world is shifting. Whereas in a long shot, a camera motion can be useful just to build up the power of the shot. Like moving from left to right across the table doesn't imply very much. It just looks better and feels better. Moving from left to right in a close-up or pushing in on someone in a close-up really matters. That's a huge statement. One of the things about that framing that was important, he was facing left the whole time. We're not to his left. He's facing away from Sugai, aggressively away from Sugai. He and Sugai are not talking to each other or at each other. He won't even face the same direction as Sugai. That's a really nice but subtle twist. He's also got a lot of these super low shots where we can see the bottom of his feet like he's stomping on the camera. The symbolism here is pretty obvious. He is going to be a villain and he's going to stomp on our face. Couldn't be more obvious. However, it works really well. It's blunt, it's pulpy, but it works perfectly at setting him up as a villain without him having to actually do anything aggressive to us. He's looking down on us and he's going to destroy us at some point in the future, according to him. So even here, notice how Someya is looking left, even though he should be looking at us. We got some two shots. Again, the reason for these two shots is because the two are talking to each other, and we need to make sure that we understand that this connection exists, at least for the current lines of dialogue.
中国人はそういう事情もお構いなしに的にかけるかもしれません。余計なお世話だ。俺に護衛は必要ない。4代目の人柄については
Notice the two shot is now gone. That's both because we want to build tension and because he's no longer talking to, he's now talking at.
気分を害されたなら申し訳ない。だから言ったじゃないですか、菅井さん。4代目に護衛なんか必要。
So now you might notice, guess what? He's now facing Sugai. But Sugai is not facing him. So now that he's talking to Sugai, they're both in frame, and he's actually addressing Sugai, so he gets to look at Sugai, but Sugai is pointedly not looking at him. There's a conflict between the two of them. And Someya is the sort of guy who takes conflicts head on and stomps on them. Now we get a two-shot between us and Someya.
さっき俺らに監視されてるって言いましたけど、それも
Two shots because we're addressing each other rather than talking at each
今
other.
やってるドンパチは俺らの世代の構想ですよ。
So keep in mind, when we came into the room, the first thing Sugai said was, "Hey, look, the old guard had to pick up the mess because the kids screwed it up." And here's Someya saying, "Fuck the old guard, I hope they all die." You can see that this conflict between Sugai and Someya is not subtle, and it's going to be a lot of the driving force between the politics of the Tojo clan during this game. So it's important to establish, and it also lets us marinate in this villainy for a little while longer.
とっくに引退された人間の出る幕じゃありません。随分と威勢がいいんだな。今の若いのは。中国マフィアとの抗争のおかげですよ。いや、だってそうでしょ。最近まではいかに金を稼げるかがヤクザの力だった。6代目体制の登場会。
So here he is literally talking out of his ass. I mean, not literally. He's literally talking nonsense. He's talking out of his ass. The sixth chairman is one of the stupidest people in any of the Yakuza games, and his assistants, his men, are not any brighter. Are you really going to call Goro Majima a very intelligent man? I mean, he's not dumb, but he's certainly a murderous weirdo. What he's doing here is he's just establishing that he is different from the people that we put in power. He is not our kind of guy. In reality, he is absolutely our kind of guy, and he'll make that very, very obvious over the course of the game. And I don't necessarily mean that in a good way. We're not exactly the paragon here. We are a violent thug. Guess what? So is Someya.
でも今は違う。でかい構想のおかげで登場界のヤクザの価値は喧嘩の強さになった。敵の首取った数がヤクザの核に直結する。
This is a little bit of a giveaway. He's talking himself in circles a little bit because he says that, you know, our time is done, we're a fossil. But then he clearly says that we're the most important person in the city right here because we have literally the highest body count of anybody on the planet. We are a really aggressive fighter. And a body count in this case does not necessarily mean murdered. I think that canon says we've never killed anybody. All the people we've thrown off the top of skyscrapers apparently lived. But in this case, he's establishing that he is going to go through the top through blood and violence, and that's all that matters. And that kind of gives away the fact that we're not so different. He's establishing himself as different from us, but like most young people, he believes himself to be more different than he is. So even though he's just clearly said that we're not important, but everything we've ever done is very important, it's him talking himself in circles. It's not on accident. Once again, the shot of the empty chair and the distance between us. Did you notice how that was framed? Not so bad, is it? And with that zoom in on him, that's because he was talking, in general at us. But now that he's actually addressing us, we're back to 2 shots. Now that he's actually talking to us, we're back to 2 shots. And now, once again, he's talking about Sugai without looking at Sugai. He's carefully looking off-screen instead. Now he's going to needle Sugai, and Sugai is going to look away from him. This kind of blocking and camera framing is really powerful and subtle, and I really enjoy seeing it put on display here. It's often very hard to get this kind of dialogue sequence to have any power to it. You gotta marinate it properly, and part of that marinade is not just the audio, but also the shots you choose. And here, of course, is the linchpin, the moment that matters most. The zoom in on a close-up. You know how I said that if the camera moves in a close-up, it's really important? Here's an example. And as before, Someya backs down. It's funny because Someya backing down is basically his entire character trait. He tries hard, he's violent, he's aggressive, but he always backs down at the last second. And I think that's a really cool character trait for a villain to have, and we'll see that happen over the course of the game several times. Notice that Sugai didn't apologize, didn't back down, just said absolutely nothing. So, putting aside the very Japanese texture of all that, as an American, it's hard for me to appreciate a lot of the nuances of exactly what was being said, when, and why. But putting aside all of that, the basic idea here is that there is a lot of marinade going on, and we're delivering that flavor minute by minute, line by line, letting the player soak it in, and it's a trickle charge. The dialogue that gets said is important, but it's mostly important to either add the marinade or to get dialogue that you needed to get out of the way. We have to know that the Tojo clan is going through internal strife. We have to know that we've got a young buck and an old man butting heads inside of Tojo, and that takes some dialogue. So one thing we could do is we could make it super obvious really, really quickly with some dialogue that's just like an aggressive bit of dialogue where they directly fight. But since we're trickle charging anyway, we might as well take our time and really steep in that sort of situation. You can do a lot of things with this kind of extended dialogue. It is not reserved for villainry. You could have a long dialogue sequence where 2 people start to slowly fall in love, or you could have a long dialogue sequence where someone teaches their kid how to play baseball, whatever. You can use it however you want because it absorbs the marinade. All you gotta do is set up that marinade. At least that's my opinion. Let me know what you think. See you around.